Supergiant Games is probably one of my favorite development studios of all time. After a decade of work and now 3.5 games under their belt, the studio still has yet to make a single misstep. The fact that Supergiant seems almost incapable of making a bad game is impressive in its own right, but that's not enough to explain why of all the indie darlings in the industry, Supergiant Games is one of the most iconic and celebrated. Why is that? Particularly because there isn't a common thread tying Supergiant's different games together. When I try to make a celebrating games video, I try to find that common thread that runs through all the games I'm talking about, but with Supergiant, there's no clean through line. There's no huge flagpole series that's become synonymous with a company's name, and each game is wildly different in tone and setting, ranging from a sci-fi noir techno-apocalypse following a singer to a story about a fantasy basketball prison league in purgatory fomenting revolt. I guess on the mechanical side, Supergiant's games could all be broadly categorized as action titles, but that's a very broad umbrella, and each game has its own unique core loop. Seemingly the only mechanical similarities between them are the isometric camera angle and their insistence on providing multiple abilities you can mix and match to make your own builds. But what you're actually doing in those games is never really the same. Each game has its own big draws and reasons why it's excellent. But just saying they're all good is about the most tenuous possible connective tissue for a video. So instead of trying to find a cohesive theme between each game, let's ask, why are they always so good? Well, let's do some quick comparisons between Bastion, Supergiant's first game, and their other projects. First, check out these two slides. The darkened halls of Hades aren't anything like Bastion's post-apocalyptic floating islands, but aside from the color palette choices, these still look pretty similar, right? Less like different games and more like different levels. That's because Supergiant's principal artist, Gen Z, has been doing this since Bastion. Similarly, you might not think this guy from Pyre...
"'Tis true what the book says. You can be free again. Perhaps not you yourself, but someone worthy of the privilege."
could possibly be voiced by the same person as this narrator in Bastion.
What do you say to a man who's seen too much? Kid hasn't a clue, but he says this: "We have to go. Please."
But in fact, they're both done by Logan Cunningham. Transistor's more techno-inclined soundtrack probably doesn't remind you very much of Bastion's acoustic guitars, but okay, you get what I'm going for by this point. Every Supergiant soundtrack has been composed by Darren Korb, whose OSTs on their own have become almost as popular as the games they're attached to, and come with the bonus of Ashley Barrett's persistent presence as a vocalist. And even with different soundtracks falling into entirely different genres, Darren's never lost his love for heavy, crunchy drum lines and guitars. Darren has his own personal style, and it's become a cornerstone of the entire company's aesthetic as well. It's the same with Gen Z and Logan Cunningham, and those three aren't alone either. There's the unique world building, interesting fleshed out characters, and non-traditional stories ushered in by Greg Kasavin, and there's all the design and programming work by longtime Supergiant developers Amir Rao, Gavin Simon, and Andrew Wong doing the heavy lifting on the development and technical support side. You can see all of these people's fingerprints throughout each of Supergiant's projects. And it was right around this point in my research that I started asking myself, hold on a minute. Just how many people have been working here since Bastion? Holy shit! Almost everyone at this company has been working here for a decade. Bastion, Transistor, Pyre, Hades. Supergiant Games' main studio staff are small enough to fit on one screen, but they are all the same people.
This is a studio where the number of folks who've moved on over the years you can count on one hand.
And that's kind of an anomaly. There may be a fair few studios that have had decade-long runs producing nothing but fantastic games, but how many can say that their work is a product of a consistent team of talent that's stuck together for so long? The answer is... not many. A studio's natural life cycle rarely lasts that long, and the dream teams behind your favorite games always slowly splinter apart as people take up different projects. In my mind, I always juxtapose Supergiant with my other favorite studios growing up. Studios that are largely unrecognizable today. My mind drifts to BioWare and how most of the developers who made my favorite games under their brand, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, Knights of the Old Republic, have all moved on and been replaced. I think about what happened to Doom and about how it took 12 years for the series to finally get back in the saddle after Doom 3. But once they did, it was killer. I think about how obsessed I used to be with Halo, and here we are, almost a decade after the property changed studios, and the most exciting thing that's happened to it in years is the Master Chief Collection getting announced for PC. I think about Descent, another beloved game from my childhood, and how the entire genre it spawned has spiraled off into obscurity. But I also think about how the team behind Descent randomly reformed after like 20 years to make Overload. And suddenly, it turned out they not only still knew exactly how to make a 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter fun and exciting, but also how to move the genre forward, and they made one of my favorite games of 2018. And I also think about one very concerning statistic I learned about recently. The 2018 GDC survey, as well as surveys from previous years, had 4,000 responses and found that the average developer that attended has only been in the industry for roughly 5 years. Now, mind you, this obviously isn't a survey of every single game developer in the world, but you would be hard-pressed to find a better vertical slice of the industry than GDC, and it's not a hard statistic to believe when put next to other ones, such as the fact that already this year alone, game companies have laid off roughly 2,000 people. And when I think about all of this, Supergiant feels like a miracle. Because this is the industry that is mired in a perpetual news cycle of layoffs that's infamous for horrific work conditions that grind down developers until they're finally burnt out and throw in the towel. This is the industry where you're forced to bounce from studio to studio, transiently uprooting your life every few years, until finally you just migrate out of the industry entirely. This is the industry where even if you're fortunate enough to help build one of the most wildly successful, multi-billion-dollar studios in the entire business, you're still not safe from being laid off as CEOs and investor margins treat developer lives like branches on a bonsai tree in need of trimming because daddy needs a new fucking super yacht. In this industry, Supergiant Games is a goddamn unicorn. The truth is that Supergiant isn't so incredible because of some clever mechanic to fall back on in all their games, or because they have some particular aesthetic claim to fame like Bastion's narrator, or because all their stories are fantastic journeys into genuinely interesting worlds. These things are all true, but they're all a direct result of these incredibly talented and hardworking people that have lent their abilities to the studio to create a decade of excellent art. Supergiant is such an incredible developer because on average, they've managed to hold on to highly skilled talent in the same single company for twice as long as the entire industry does. And I don't think you need to go very far to find compelling evidence supporting that claim. In fact, the best case for my argument just came out in December. Let's talk about Hades. As an isometric hack-and-slash roguelite, Hades is the closest to coming around full circle from Bastion that Supergiant has ever been. While not identical, combat falls into a similar flow in both games, and the company's persistent interest in modular loadouts is a natural fit that was begging to be implemented into a roguelike. They even find a way to bring a narrator into the proceedings as an entertaining, overly dramatic side character that has fourth-wall-breaking conversations with our hero Zagreus.
You know I can hear you, old man.
But the difference that comes from the extra 8 years and 3 development cycles of experience since Bastion is immediately obvious. If you go back and play Bastion, it's still a pretty fun game that mostly holds up. But play these games back to back, and its combat feels clunky and borderline bumbling compared to Hades. A lot of this is in super specific nitpicks, like how you can't animation cancel melee attacks in Bastion, but in Hades you can do that all day long, forcing you to commit to your attacks makes sense in a more methodical game like Dark Souls, but in a fast-paced hack and slash where enemies go from wind up to hit in less than a second and ignore hit stun, Hades just takes the better route. And you can see these improvements everywhere in the game. Remember those little tweaks you could give your weapons in the armory in Bastion? Blown away by Hades' roguelike elements. Bastion's armory and distillery gave you some minor buffs, but they mostly just tacked bigger numbers onto your character, if you could even notice them in the first place. Hades' boons, and more importantly the Daedalus Hammer, completely change how you play. Finding a Daedalus Hammer is almost like picking up an entirely new weapon, and that's only possible because Hades' weapons are all multifunctional tools with a great deal more complexity than what Bastion's had. The end result is that deciding on a build is way more interesting and vibrant an experience in Hades. Every weapon in this game is fun, dynamic, and has multiple ways it can be used. And even as great as it is, that's not something I can actually say about Bastion. Hades' improvements extend beyond just its gameplay as well. The art style has grown sharper and more saturated over the years, character animations are smoother and more dynamic, and their use of a narrator grown defter and more nuanced. Darren Korb's music remains excellent, but the studio's soundtracks have only grown more expansive and technically impressive over the years, from Pyre's straight-up 3 full soundtracks of songs to modular music that contextually adjusts in intensity depending on what you're doing in the game. And you could maybe argue that I'm getting lost in the weeds here, but Bastion is already a great game, and the little details like this are how you elevate your craft from great to outstanding. These are the kind of tweaks you learn when you're already an excellent developer, but still spend another 8 years learning how to be an even better one. This isn't improvement per se, it's maturation. At the start of this video, I said that no two Supergiant games play alike, and that's not wrong. But you can also find elements of everything I just talked about in Hades in all 3 of Supergiant's previous works, slowly evolving, crystallizing, growing more nuanced. With every iteration, Supergiant improves on the core elements of their games, only unlike most other studios, the entire staff that internalized the lessons from Bastion stuck around to incorporate them in Hades 8 years later. So alright, Supergiant clearly is benefiting from their wealth of retained talent, but the question still remains. How are they retaining them in the first place? What is this company doing that's making everyone want to stay? Burning to know the answer to that question, I went and asked them. Michael Ailshie has been working at Supergiant for almost 8 years. His official job title is Studio Operations, but he does everything from HR work and managing the studio's finances to voicing Orpheus and Hades. And when I came knocking at Supergiant with a list of questions, he was the one who was kind enough to take the valuable time out of his day to give me some anecdotal answers. Ailshie first joined up with Supergiant after seeing Bastion. As part of the first big wave of indie developers, Supergiant was something new back when Bastion released in 2011. These were the companies that were just starting to popularize the now blooming indie scene we all appreciate today, and Ailshie took notice. In his own words, I was immediately inspired by the scope of this team's artistic achievement relative to their small size. Supergiant represented an opportunity to make an outsized impact on a rapidly changing video game industry, and it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. Even after 8 years at the company, he says that he can easily imagine himself staying for far longer, and then commented that he was, quote, inspired by the team's ability to adapt to the industry, care for its own, support other developers, and prioritize sustainability. And while Ailshie didn't directly go into the specifics about how the company's treated him and his fellow co-workers over the years, he did mention a few basic things about how Supergiant is run that seem to have contributed to his positive opinion of his workplace. It wasn't anything particularly revolutionary either. Regular company review sessions that constantly evaluate how the studio is running, and a company culture that emphasizes communication, collaboration, and, quote, mindfulness of the impact we have on each other. As Ailshie put it, we iterate on our studio process in the same way we iterate on a game like Hades, considering feedback, identifying practical opportunities for improvement, and implementing changes to test those opportunities. And all of that is really basic stuff. It's not hard to implement these things. It's easier for a small company like Supergiant, where the entire staff fits into one room, than it is for a AAA studio, but this is Company Management 101. There's no secret special sauce here, just a company that treats its employees with basic dignity and respect. When Ailshie brought up the particularly difficult topic of work-life balance, it also sounded like Supergiant was a company that tried to emphasize healthy work habits. He said, on a personal level, I've grown to embrace the idea that my work at Supergiant conforms to my life outside of it. There will always be more work than time, especially in a studio of our size, and there's a natural desire to prove oneself capable of handling it all, to be everywhere at once. Embracing my own constraints allows me to seek support when it's needed, learn something I may not have otherwise known, and strengthen my confidence in my fellow Supergiants. And when I asked him about the benefits of having such a consistent development team to work with, he had this to say. One of Supergiant's greatest strengths lies in the creative chemistry of the team. We believe that the best decisions are made in small groups, where folks can express themselves with candor and trust in their colleagues to provide honest feedback. In many ways, each of our games since Bastion has been a response to the game that came before, and our consistent development team provides us with valuable shared context around what worked, what didn't, and what we can do better. Now granted, a lot of what Ailshi's talking about has as much to do with the size of the team as their familiarity and experience with each other. Having a smaller company where you know everybody's face seems to have very much contributed to that chemistry he's talking about, but that's not to discount the breadth of experience this team has built up together, which was also a sentiment echoed by Amir Rao, head of design and studio operations at Supergiant, who had this to say. All our past games have informed how we organize our work and the projects we decided to work on together. The shared understanding and context starts all our decisions from a place of shared experience and strength. In my video about Return of the Obra Dinn, I said that I hoped that by highlighting an example of a game that operates differently, it would start getting us to think about how everyone else can learn from those lessons. And that desire is still the same here. Video game development is an ocean of malpractice and abuse that actively breaks down and drives talent out of the industry. You can see it in everything from the toxic behavior being reported on at NetherRealm to the quote-unquote BioWare magic that Jason Schreier recently wrote about, detailing how BioWare habitually crunches games together at the last minute of their development cycles. Even success stories like Epic Games' Fortnite were paved by a developer death march to provide an inhuman rate of content updates, something that not only burns out Epic's developers, but also puts pressure on every competing game in the Battle Royale field to do the same thing just to keep up. For richer or poorer, whether a company goes out of business or becomes one of the biggest players in the industry, it's more likely than not that they got there on the backs of developers that were underpaid, overworked, harassed, and in many cases, then discarded. And Supergiant Games, as an island of retained talent in that ocean of malpractice, is an example of some of the ways we can potentially start doing better. Supergiant's working conditions are not an accident. They happen when you take the step of actually giving a shit about the people working around you. And what I talk to them about for this video just barely scratches the surface. So please, developers, publishers, financiers, whoever you are, if you work in video games, please learn from Supergiant. I understand that the concerns facing a small studio like Supergiant are drastically different from those of a multi-billion-dollar corporation trying to become a trillion-dollar corporation, but there's a very simple lesson to learn here. A video game studio is not your personal bonsai tree. It's a complicated organism filled with people trying to do something they're deeply passionate about in spite of overwhelming headwinds. And when developers find the rare studio like Supergiant Games that's a genuinely safe roost from those headwinds, they take notice, they stay, and they leverage their talents and passion towards creating incredible games that the entire medium profits from. I don't think I need to explain why that would be an immense boon to any company. And if nothing else, there's one thing that I firmly believe and hope to get across with this video. Supergiant Games should be the norm, not an outlier. Creative industries are particularly wild and turbulent. Yes, but we should all be striving towards the ideal that Supergiant has come to embody in my mind. A place that feels safe and stable to work at. A place where workers feel provided for and like they can actually lay down roots. And ultimately, a place that fosters a dedicated team of masters in their craft that spend a full decade and counting doing nothing but creating incredible games that we all can enjoy.
All are not the same, but three shall be as one.
Before I go, I just wanted to extend a massive thank you to the folks at Supergiant Games, who literally had no reason to take the time to answer my questions other than out of the kindness of their hearts. I also want to give a big thank you to Danny O'Dwyer, who similarly was gracious enough to not just give me the time of day, but help me get in contact with and set up an interview with Supergiant, as well as kindly letting me use footage from his own no-clip docs. Without either Danny or Supergiant's cooperation, this video probably wouldn't have happened. And thank you as well to all of you for actually watching this far. If you're interested in more long-form content, I've got a few other video essays you can check out on everything from boss rush games like Fury and Cuphead to a deep dive on Return of the Obra Dinn. But my main bread and butter are my reviews, where I try to look for short, tightly constructed games much like Supergiant's that you can enjoy on a busy schedule. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you guys next time.